December 15th, 1947. Arlington, Virginia. Robert Morrison's hands trembled as he opened the manila folder marked Classification Indefinite Operation Blackout. Inside, photographs that would haunt him forever. A Japanese prisoner strapped to a surgical table, electrodes attached to his skull. Another image showed a man's vacant stare after what the caption coldly described as Psychological Reconditioning Day 47. But it was the handwritten note clipped to the front that stopped Morrison's heart. Per General MacArthur's directive, all evidence of enhanced interrogation protocols to be destroyed immediately. No exceptions. Any personnel discussing these operations will face immediate court-martial and potential elimination. Morrison slammed the folder shut. His supervisor had left early that night. The archive wing was empty. He was alone with America's darkest secret. The next morning, Morrison reported to work as usual. He never spoke about what he had seen. But he began keeping a diary. Hidden entries that would surface 30 years later, written in a code only his daughter would eventually crack. The screaming never stops in my dreams. They made them disappear. All of them. And then they made the evidence disappear too. Morrison wasn't the only one carrying these secrets. Across America, men who had returned from the Pacific Theater were living with memories that didn't match the heroic narrative everyone else celebrated. They had witnessed something that contradicted everything they thought they were fighting for. And they had been sworn to silence by threats that went far beyond military discipline. If you're ready to uncover the truth that powerful men died to protect, subscribe now. Because what you're about to hear will shatter everything you thought you knew about America's conduct in World War II. This isn't history class. This is the story they tried to erase. Dr. Thomas Bradley had been drinking for 3 straight days when his daughter found him in his study, surrounded by old military photographs and medals he'd earned in the Pacific. It was 1958, 13 years after the war ended, but Tom Bradley looked like a man still fighting battles in his head. "Sarah," he whispered to his daughter, his voice cracking. "There are things I did, things they made us do to the Japanese prisoners. Things that weren't in any manual, weren't covered by any law. We called it enhanced debriefing, but it was torture. Pure and simple." Sarah Bradley later recalled that conversation as the moment she realized her father was living with something far worse than combat trauma. "He told me about a place called Facility C7. He said they brought prisoners there who had valuable intelligence, but what they did to extract that intelligence, he said it would have made the Nazis proud." Tom Bradley wasn't alone in his guilt. Across Veterans Administration hospitals, psychiatrists were seeing a pattern they couldn't explain. Combat veterans suffering from what they called moral injury, psychological damage that went beyond witnessing violence to participating in acts that violated their deepest beliefs about right and wrong. Dr. Margaret Walsh, who treated veterans at the Baltimore VA from 1952 to 1979, kept detailed notes about these cases. Her files, discovered after her death, revealed the scope of what had been hidden. Patient exhibits severe anxiety when discussing POW operations. Claims to have participated in medical experiments on Japanese prisoners. Describes surgical procedures performed without anesthesia. Details are consistent with other patients reporting similar experiences at classified facilities. But the most damning evidence came from the veterans themselves. Staff Sergeant William Hayes had kept a diary throughout his service, despite explicit orders not to document prisoner operations. His entries paint a picture of systematic cruelty that escalated far beyond military necessity. Day 12 at the facility. Dr. Kellerman arrived with new equipment, electrical stimulation devices, and syringes filled with drugs I can't pronounce. The Japanese pilot they brought in yesterday is strapped to a metal table. Kellerman says we're testing enhanced interrogation techniques, but this looks more like torture to me. The pilot screams in 3 languages when they apply the current. Johnson threw up during his shift and asked for a transfer. Request denied. Hayes wrote his final entry 3 months later. "I don't know what we've become. These aren't prisoners of war anymore. They're laboratory animals. The pilot from yesterday doesn't remember his own name. They've broken something fundamental in his mind. When this war ends, how do we live with what we've done?" Hayes never found an answer. He shot himself in 1962, leaving behind his diary and a suicide note that simply read, "Some sins can't be forgiven. Some secrets shouldn't be kept." But Hayes wasn't the only veteran who couldn't live with what he'd witnessed. Between 1958 and 1965, 17 men who had served at classified Pacific facilities died by suicide. 3 more died in suspicious accidents after attempting to contact journalists. The message was clear: some secrets were worth killing to protect. The Japanese families searching for their missing loved ones faced a wall of lies and misdirection. Akiko Tanaka spent 43 years trying to learn what happened to her husband, Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, shot down over the Philippines in 1944. The official record stated he died of dysentery in a standard POW camp. The classified files told a different story. "Mrs. Tanaka wrote to us every month for over 2 decades," recalled James Patterson, a State Department official who handled POW inquiries. "Same questions, same desperate hope that we might have overlooked something. We had explicit instructions to tell her nothing about the classified facilities. She died never knowing that her husband had been transferred to Facility C7, where he underwent 3 months of experimental interrogation before dying during a procedure designed to test the effects of prolonged sensory deprivation." The cover-up was as methodical as the original crimes. Starting in January 1945, high-ranking officials began planning how to hide evidence of what they had done. General MacArthur's office generated 47 directives regarding prisoner handling. Only 6 survived the systematic document destruction that followed the war's end. Dr. Marcus Kellerman, the German émigré who designed the experimental protocols, had his research files shipped to a classified facility in Nevada where they remained sealed for over 50 years. Personnel who had participated in the program were transferred to new assignments with warnings that discussing their previous work would result in treason charges. The prisoners themselves simply vanished from all official records. Transfer orders led nowhere. Death certificates were never filed. Bodies were cremated immediately and ashes scattered at sea. Men who had entered American custody alive became statistical ghosts, their existence erased from history. Prisoner 2847, identified only as Yamamoto H. in fragmentary records, exemplified the systematic dehumanization of the program. A Japanese naval officer captured in 1944, he underwent 6 months of experimental procedures that included drug-induced interrogation, surgical implantation of monitoring devices, and psychological conditioning designed to fracture his personality. Kellerman's notes, discovered decades later, described the process in clinical detail. Subject shows resistance to standard interrogation. Implementing Protocol 7 surgical modification of hippocampus to enhance memory recall under chemical stimulation. Subject remained conscious throughout procedure to provide real-time feedback. Significant data obtained regarding structural modifications and their effect on information retrieval. The final entry in Yamamoto's file was dated March 15, 1945. Subject expired during experimental procedure. Cause of death: cardiac arrest during electrical stimulation of temporal lobe. Body disposed of per standard protocol. Research data classified indefinitely. What Yamamoto's family never knew was that he had volunteered no information during his captivity. The experiments weren't designed to extract intelligence. They were conducted to test techniques that would later be used on other prisoners, American soldiers captured by enemies, and eventually civilians in intelligence operations around the world. The scale of the deception became clear through the testimony of Dr. Patricia Williams, a military nurse who worked at Facility C7 for 8 months in 1944 and 45. Her account, recorded during psychiatric treatment in the 1980s, provided the most detailed first-hand description of the experimental program. "They told us we were saving American lives," Dr. Williams recalled through tears. "That these prisoners had information that could end the war faster. But I watched them perform surgery on men who had already told them everything they knew. I assisted with procedures that served no intelligence purpose. They were testing new drugs, studying the effects of brain surgery, seeing how much psychological pressure a human mind could endure before it snapped completely." Dr. Williams described prisoners who arrived healthy but were systematically broken down through a combination of medical procedures and psychological torture. One prisoner, a young pilot, was subjected to 63 days of sensory deprivation. When they finally brought him out, he couldn't speak, couldn't recognize faces, couldn't perform basic human functions. They had destroyed his mind completely, and then they studied the results like he was a laboratory specimen. The medical records that survived document 17 different experimental protocols tested on Japanese prisoners. These included surgical implantation of electrodes, injection of experimental drugs, surgical removal of brain tissue for analysis, and psychological conditioning techniques designed to create dissociative personalities. Perhaps most disturbing was Protocol 12, which aimed to create what classified documents called programmable assets, prisoners who had been so thoroughly psychologically reconstructed that they could be given new identities and used as intelligence operatives. The technique involved complete personality dissolution through drug therapy and psychological manipulation, followed by implantation of false memories and constructed identities. Internal documents reference at least 17 prisoners who underwent complete identity reconstruction under Protocol 12. Their ultimate fate remains unknown. Some investigators believe they were used as double agents in post-war Japan. Others suspect they were eliminated when their usefulness ended. The truth remains buried in files classified at levels so high that even congressional oversight committees have been denied access. The post-war war crimes trials were carefully structured to avoid any examination of American conduct. When Japanese defense attorneys attempted to introduce evidence of American prisoner abuse, military judges ruled such evidence irrelevant and inadmissible. The trials became exercises in victor's justice, prosecuting enemy war crimes while ignoring identical crimes committed by Allied forces. This selective justice established a precedent that would influence American conduct in subsequent conflicts. If prisoner abuse could be justified as necessary for national security and hidden through classification, then international law became merely a constraint on the powerless. The Geneva Convention applied only to enemies, not to America's own operations. The techniques developed at facilities like C7 were refined and incorporated into post-war intelligence operations. Dr. Marcus Kellerman's research formed the foundation for programs like MKUltra, which applied similar experimental methods to American citizens and foreign prisoners during the Cold War. General Robert Henderson, who had served as a junior officer at Facility C7, later became a senior CIA official in charge of developing enhanced interrogation techniques for use against Soviet prisoners. His classified memos from the 1960s explicitly reference the lessons learned from the Japanese prisoner experiments. The enhanced protocols developed during Pacific operations proved their effectiveness in extracting actionable intelligence. Henderson wrote in a memo dated March 12, 1962. These techniques should be adapted for current operational requirements, with modifications appropriate to contemporary security concerns. The institutional knowledge and moral framework developed during the Japanese prisoner experiments influenced American intelligence operations for decades. Each new conflict brought revelations of prisoner abuse, but these were presented as isolated incidents rather than manifestations of systematic policies that trace directly back to World War II. You're witnessing how techniques developed through torture became standard operating procedures that influenced American conduct in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and beyond. The pattern was established with Japanese prisoners and has been repeated for over 70 years. If you want to understand how government secrecy enables systematic abuse, share this investigation. Because the only way to break cycles of violence is to expose the connections between past and present. The breakthrough that would finally expose the full scope of the cover-up came in 1998, when construction workers renovating a former military facility in California made an extraordinary discovery. Behind a false wall, sealed since 1946, they found a cache of documents that had been hidden instead of destroyed. The cache contained over 3,000 photographs, medical records, correspondence, and research reports that provided direct evidence of the experimental program. Someone with access to the destruction order had chosen to preserve evidence rather than eliminate it, creating a time capsule of systematic abuse that had been hidden for over 50 years. The photographs were the most damning evidence. They showed prisoners in various stages of medical procedures, psychological testing, and physical abuse. Some images were clearly taken for scientific documentation, clinical shots of surgical procedures, and experimental setups. Others appeared to be trophy photos taken by personnel who wanted to memorialize their participation in the program. One photograph showed a Japanese prisoner strapped to a table while electrodes were attached to his head and genitals. The caption on the back read, "Subject 7 to 12, Day 3 of Electrical Stimulation Protocol. Note facial expressions indicating severe distress. Valuable data being obtained on pain thresholds and memory formation under extreme stress." Another image captured the moment a prisoner's skull was opened during an experimental brain surgery. The prisoner was conscious, his eyes wide with terror as medical personnel probed his exposed brain tissue with electrical instruments. The clinical notes attached to the photograph documented the subject's responses to stimulation of different brain regions. The medical records found with the photographs detailed procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics. They showed systematic experimentation on prisoners who had provided no informed consent and who were given no medical care beyond what was necessary to keep them alive during the experiments. Report 47C, dated April 23, 1945, described an experiment involving the surgical implantation of electrodes in multiple prisoners' brains to study the effects of electrical stimulation on memory formation. The prisoners were kept conscious during the procedures to provide real-time feedback about the effects of the stimulation. The report noted that subjects experienced significant distress during the procedures, but that valuable data was obtained about the relationship between electrical stimulation and memory suppression. The correspondence found in the cache revealed the involvement of high-ranking officials in authorizing and covering up the program. Letters between General MacArthur's headquarters and military medical personnel showed that the experimental program had explicit approval from the highest levels of command. One letter, dated July 19, 1945, from General MacArthur's chief medical officer to the Pentagon, stated, "Enhanced debriefing protocols have yielded significant intelligence regarding Japanese military capabilities and strategic planning. However, continuation of these operations poses substantial legal and political risks. Recommend immediate implementation of Protocol 7 to ensure operational security." Protocol 7, according to other documents in the cache, was the comprehensive plan to destroy all evidence of the experimental program and eliminate any witnesses who might compromise operational security. The protocol included specific instructions for document destruction, personnel transfers, and the elimination of prisoners who had been subjected to experimental procedures. The discovery of these documents triggered an international investigation that finally brought the scope of the cover-up into public view. Japanese officials, who had suspected American misconduct but lacked evidence, now had documentation to support decades of claims about missing prisoners and systematic abuse. Ichiro Matsumoto, who was 19 when captured in the Philippines in 1944, had never been able to prove his account of systematic torture and medical experimentation. The discovered documents included his complete file, corroborating every detail of the abuse he had described for over 50 years. "They told me I was being treated for combat injuries," Matsumoto testified during congressional hearings in 1999. "But the treatments were not healing me. They were changing me. They would inject me with drugs that made me forget who I was, then show me photographs and documents while I was confused and disoriented. They performed surgery on my head and told me it was to repair shrapnel damage, but there had been no shrapnel wounds. They were experimenting on me like I was a laboratory rat." Matsumoto's medical file, found in the cache, documented exactly the procedures he had described. It showed that he had been selected for Protocol 12, the Identity Reconstruction Program, because of his education and role as a communications officer. The file tracked his psychological deterioration over 14 months of experimental procedures designed to completely reconstruct his personality and memory. The final entry in Matsumoto's file, dated September 3, 1945, stated, "Subject shows successful integration of implanted identity structure. Original personality appears completely suppressed. Subject now responds to designation Michael Thompson and believes himself to be American intelligence operative, ready for operational deployment. But the war ended before Matsumoto could be deployed, and he was instead subjected to memory restoration protocols, designed to return him to his original identity for repatriation. The process was only partially successful, leaving him with fragmented memories and psychological trauma that persisted for the rest of his life. The cache also contained evidence of the systematic elimination of witnesses. A memo dated August 7, 1945, from the facility commander to General MacArthur's headquarters, listed 17 prisoners who posed potential security risks due to extensive knowledge of experimental protocols. The memo recommended permanent elimination to ensure operational security. Another document, dated 2 weeks later, confirmed that the recommendation had been approved and implemented. All high-risk subjects eliminated per authorized protocol. Bodies disposed of according to standard procedures. Facility prepared for decommissioning and evidence destruction. The human cost of the experimental program extended far beyond the immediate victims. Family members of both prisoners and American personnel suffered for decades from the psychological impact of secrets they couldn't understand or discuss. Dorothy Hayes, daughter of the sergeant whose diary documented his participation in the program, spent decades trying to understand her father's suicide and his cryptic references to terrible things he had done during the war. He would wake up screaming about Japanese voices and medical procedures, she recalled. He told me once that he had participated in things that would make me ashamed of him if I knew the details. I thought he was talking about combat, about killing enemy soldiers in battle. I never imagined he was talking about torturing prisoners and assisting with human experimentation. The cache documents included personnel files that confirmed Hayes's participation in the experimental program and documented the psychological counseling he received after attempting to refuse orders to participate in particularly brutal procedures. His file noted significant moral distress and recommended enhanced psychological support to maintain operational effectiveness. Similarly, families of Japanese prisoners struggled with the long-term effects of experimental procedures on their loved ones who survived and returned home. Many survivors experienced severe psychological symptoms that family members couldn't understand or treat effectively. Kenji Yamada's father had been subjected to Protocol 9, a psychological conditioning program designed to create dissociative personalities. When he returned to Japan, he exhibited symptoms that his family attributed to combat trauma and prisoner of war hardships. He couldn't remember large portions of his life before the war, Kenji explained. He would become agitated when he heard certain sounds or saw certain objects. He had surgical scars on his head that he claimed were from combat injuries, but they looked like deliberate medical procedures. He would sometimes respond to questions as if he was someone else entirely, speaking in a different voice and claiming a different name. The family struggled for decades to understand and cope with these symptoms. It was only after the discovery of the classified documents that they learned their father had been subjected to experimental psychological procedures designed to fragment his personality and implant false identity structures. The international response to these revelations was swift and condemning. The United Nations Human Rights Commission called for a full investigation and prosecutions of those responsible for the systematic abuse. Japanese officials demanded reparations for the families of victims and formal acknowledgement of American war crimes. The American government's response was to classify additional documents and assert that prosecutions were impossible due to the passage of time and the death of most participants. Officials argued that the experimental program had been conducted under extraordinary wartime conditions and that applying contemporary legal standards to historical actions was inappropriate. But the revelations had broader implications beyond historical accountability. They demonstrated how classification and secrecy could be used to hide systematic human rights violations for decades, and how institutional cultures developed during one conflict could influence conduct in subsequent wars. The techniques developed during the Japanese prisoner experiments had been refined and used in Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts. Each new war brought revelations of prisoner abuse, but these were consistently presented as isolated incidents rather than manifestations of systematic policies with clear historical precedents. Understanding the connection between World War II experiments and modern interrogation techniques provided crucial context for contemporary debates about prisoner treatment and government accountability. The same legal arguments, classification strategies, and institutional justifications used to hide the Japanese prisoner experiments had been employed repeatedly to avoid accountability for torture and abuse in later conflicts. Dr. Jennifer Coleman, who studied the continuity between World War II and contemporary interrogation practices, found direct connections between techniques developed at facilities like C7 and methods used at Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, and CIA black sites around the world. The psychological techniques used to break Japanese prisoners were documented, refined, and incorporated into training manuals used by military and intelligence personnel for over 60 years. Dr. Coleman explained. What appeared to be isolated incidents of abuse were actually applications of systematic methods that had been developed and perfected through decades of experimentation on prisoners who had no legal protections or advocacy. The legal framework that enabled the Japanese prisoner experiments also provided precedents for avoiding accountability in later cases. Classification of evidence, assertions of national security privilege, and claims that extreme measures were necessary to protect American lives became standard responses to allegations of systematic abuse. The psychological impact on American society of these revelations was profound and lasting. The knowledge that systematic torture and human experimentation had been conducted by American forces during the Good War challenged fundamental assumptions about American moral leadership and commitment to human rights. For some Americans, the revelations confirmed long-standing suspicions about government misconduct and validated concerns about unchecked military and intelligence power. For others, the evidence was too disturbing to accept, and they preferred to dismiss it as exaggerated, taken out of context, or fabricated by hostile forces seeking to undermine American credibility. This division reflected broader tensions in American society about accountability, transparency, and the balance between national security and civil liberties. The systematic cover-up of the experimental program demonstrated how governments could maintain public support for military operations while simultaneously concealing evidence of systematic crimes committed in the name of national defense. As you process these revelations about how systematic torture was developed, refined, and hidden for over 70 years, remember that the institutional cultures and legal frameworks that enabled these crimes still exist today. The only protection against their repetition is public awareness and demand for accountability. Subscribe and share this investigation, because understanding how these patterns operate is the first step toward breaking them. The legacy of the Japanese prisoner experimental program extends directly into contemporary American military and intelligence operations. The institutional knowledge, moral frameworks, and operational procedures developed during World War II created precedents that continue to influence government conduct in the 21st century. Robert Morrison, the archivist who first discovered evidence of Operation Blackout in 1947, lived to see fragments of the truth finally emerge in the 1990s. By then in his 80s, he agreed to be interviewed about his discovery and its impact on his life. "I carried that secret for 50 years, Morrison said during his final interview before his death in 2001. "I thought about going to the newspapers, about telling Congress, about doing something to expose what I had seen. But they made it clear that discussing classified operations would result in treason charges and imprisonment. So I stayed silent, and I've regretted that silence every day since." Morrison's interview revealed additional details about the scope of the cover-up. As an archivist, he had access to filing systems that showed the systematic removal and destruction of documents related to prisoner operations. He estimated that over 90% of records related to the experimental program had been destroyed or permanently classified. "It wasn't random document destruction," Morrison explained. "It was systematic elimination of specific categories of evidence. Medical records, personnel files, operational reports, correspondence, anything that could document what had really happened to those prisoners. They left just enough innocuous material to maintain the illusion of transparency while hiding all the evidence of systematic abuse. Morrison also revealed that other archivists and clerks had discovered similar evidence over the years, but all had been silenced through classification orders, transferred to other positions, or direct threats. The cover-up was maintained not just through document destruction, but through systematic intimidation of anyone who might expose the truth. The international implications of these revelations extended far beyond historical accountability. They provided context for understanding patterns of American conduct in subsequent conflicts, and raised fundamental questions about the credibility of official denials regarding prisoner treatment. When allegations of torture and abuse emerged from American operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, officials consistently claimed that such incidents were isolated examples of individual misconduct rather than systematic policies. The historical evidence from the Japanese prisoner experiments demonstrated that similar claims had been made to hide systematic abuse for over 60 years. The techniques used to torture Japanese prisoners: sensory deprivation, sexual humiliation, psychological manipulation, prolonged stress positions, and medical exploitation appeared repeatedly in accounts from contemporary conflicts. The consistency suggested not coincidence, but institutional continuity in the methods and justifications used for prisoner abuse. Dr. Sarah Chin, now in her 90s, reflected on the parallels she observed between the veteran testimonies she heard in the 1950s and accounts from veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. The same patterns of moral injury, the same descriptions of systematic abuse disguised as intelligence operations, the same official denials and cover-ups, Dr. Chin observed. The uniforms were different, the locations were different, but the institutional behavior was identical. The techniques developed during World War II had become standard operating procedures that were passed down through generations of military and intelligence personnel. The educational implications remain significant. American students continue to learn sanitized versions of World War II history that emphasize American moral leadership, while omitting crucial information about systematic war crimes and their cover-up. This incomplete education perpetuates the conditions that enable similar crimes in contemporary conflicts. History textbooks that portray American forces as universally committed to humanitarian principles are contradicted by documented evidence of systematic torture and human experimentation. The failure to acknowledge these crimes in educational curricula means that each new generation learns the same incomplete narrative that enabled the original cover-up. Some educators have attempted to incorporate information about the experimental program into their teaching, but they face resistance from administrators, parents, and political officials who prefer to maintain simplified narratives about American conduct. The ongoing classification of many documents makes it difficult to provide complete accounts even when educators are willing to address controversial material. The role of media organizations in maintaining the cover-up also continues to influence public understanding. Major news outlets that provide extensive coverage of human rights violations by enemy forces often minimize or ignore evidence of systematic abuse by American forces. This selective coverage reinforces public perceptions that torture and systematic abuse are problems associated with America's enemies rather than America itself. When evidence of the Japanese prisoner experiments first became public in the 1990s, coverage was inconsistent and often relegated to brief mentions or historical curiosity pieces rather than front-page investigations of systematic war crimes. The limited coverage meant that most Americans remain unaware of the scope and implications of what was revealed. International media provided more extensive coverage, particularly in countries that had experienced American military operations. This disparity in coverage contributed to a growing gap between American self-perception and international perceptions of American conduct, with Americans often unaware of how their government's actions were viewed globally. The academic response has been more sustained, with researchers continuing to investigate connections between historical and contemporary abuse. Universities have established research programs focused on documenting patterns of government misconduct and analyzing the institutional factors that enable systematic human rights violations. This research has revealed additional connections between the Japanese prisoner experiments and other cases of government-sponsored abuse. The techniques and justifications used during World War II were similar to those employed in medical experiments on American citizens, torture of prisoners during the Cold War, and interrogation methods used in contemporary conflicts. Understanding these connections is crucial for developing effective strategies to prevent future abuses. Legal and policy reforms must address not only specific techniques, but also the institutional cultures and procedural frameworks that enable systematic misconduct across different contexts and time periods. The families of both victims and perpetrators continue to struggle with the long-term consequences of the experimental program and its cover-up. Many descendants of prisoners who were subjected to experimental procedures have experienced intergenerational trauma that affects their mental health and family relationships. Kenji Tanaka, son of Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, who died during experimental procedures at Facility C7, has spent decades advocating for acknowledgement and reparations for the families of victims. His efforts have been consistently blocked by assertions of national security and claims that historical grievances cannot be addressed through contemporary legal systems. "My father was tortured to death by American forces, and his killers were never prosecuted," Tanaka stated during congressional testimony in 2003. Instead, they were promoted and transferred to other positions where they could continue their work. The techniques they developed using my father as a test subject were later used to torture other prisoners in other wars. His death contributed to a legacy of systematic abuse that continues today. Similarly, families of American personnel who participated in the experimental program continue to deal with the psychological consequences of secrets and shame that were passed down through generations. Many children and grandchildren of program participants have struggled with inherited trauma and incomplete knowledge about their family histories. The therapeutic community has recognized the need for specialized treatment approaches for families affected by government-sponsored torture and abuse. Support groups for families of both victims and perpetrators have been established, but participation is often limited by ongoing classification of relevant information and fear of legal consequences for discussing sensitive material. The legal implications extend beyond historical accountability to contemporary questions about the scope of government power and the effectiveness of legal constraints on official conduct. The Japanese prisoner experiments demonstrated that international law, constitutional protections, and military regulations could all be circumvented when officials were determined to pursue extreme measures and willing to use classification to avoid oversight. Contemporary legal scholars have argued that the systematic nature of the experimental program and its cover-up represented crimes against humanity that should not be subject to statutes of limitations or national security exemptions. They point out that the techniques developed through torture of Japanese prisoners continue to influence government conduct, making accountability for historical crimes relevant to preventing contemporary abuses. Human rights advocates have used the case to argue for stronger protections for prisoners and greater transparency in government operations that might affect human rights. They emphasize that the experimental program violated not only international law but also American constitutional principles and military regulations, demonstrating that multiple layers of legal protection had failed to prevent systematic abuse. The broader implications for American democracy and international relations continue to unfold. The knowledge that American officials systematically tortured prisoners and then covered up evidence of their crimes for decades has undermined American credibility in promoting human rights and international law around the world. Foreign governments and international organizations now approach American claims about human rights and prisoner treatment with skepticism informed by historical knowledge of systematic deception. This erosion of credibility has practical consequences for American foreign policy and international cooperation on human rights issues. The domestic implications are equally significant. Public trust in government institutions and military leadership has been eroded by repeated revelations of systematic abuse and cover-ups. Citizens who learn about the scope of official deception regarding prisoner treatment become more skeptical of government claims about the necessity and legality of security operations. This skepticism is both healthy and problematic. While it provides protection against future abuses by encouraging public oversight of government operations, it also makes it more difficult for officials to maintain public support for legitimate security operations that may be necessary to protect national interests. The challenge for American society is to develop institutional mechanisms that provide effective oversight of security operations without compromising legitimate operational requirements. This requires transparency sufficient to enable public accountability, while maintaining security necessary for effective operations. The Japanese prisoner experimental program demonstrates both the necessity and the difficulty of achieving this balance. The systematic abuse and cover-up occurred because officials were able to claim national security justifications for extreme measures while avoiding meaningful oversight or accountability. But addressing these problems requires institutional changes that may limit operational flexibility in ways that could compromise legitimate security interests. Robert Morrison, the archivist who first discovered evidence of Operation Blackout, offered his own perspective on this dilemma during his final interview. The problem isn't that we needed those secrets to protect national security. The problem is that we used national security to protect secrets that documented our own crimes. Until we can distinguish between legitimate classification and criminal cover-up, we'll keep repeating the same mistakes. Morrison's observation captures the fundamental challenge revealed by the Japanese prisoner experiments. The institutional mechanisms designed to protect legitimate security interests were perverted into tools for hiding systematic human rights violations. The same classification systems, legal frameworks, and oversight procedures that enable necessary intelligence and military operations also enable the cover-up of systematic abuse. Understanding this dual nature of security institutions is crucial for developing effective reforms. Changes that would prevent cover-ups of abuse might also compromise protection of legitimate secrets. Conversely, maintaining strong classification systems to protect legitimate operations also maintains the tools necessary for covering up systematic crimes. The solution requires not elimination of security institutions, but development of mechanisms that can distinguish between legitimate security requirements and criminal cover-ups. This may involve independent oversight systems, legal frameworks that provide stronger protections for whistleblowers, and cultural changes that prioritize accountability over institutional protection. The Japanese prisoner experimental program and its cover-up provide a template for understanding how institutional failures enable systematic abuse and how those same institutions resist accountability and reform. The patterns established during World War II have been repeated in subsequent conflicts because the underlying institutional problems have never been adequately addressed. Breaking these patterns requires acknowledging the full scope of what occurred during the Japanese prisoner experiments, understanding how the institutional mechanisms that enable those crimes continue to operate today, and implementing reforms that address both historical accountability and prevention of future abuses. The voices of the victims, their families, the perpetrators, and the witnesses all contribute to an understanding that transcends the specific historical context of World War II. Their experiences reveal universal patterns in how power operates without constraint, how institutions protect themselves at the expense of justice, and how ordinary people become complicit in systematic abuse when they accept official justifications without demanding evidence or accountability. The story of the Japanese prisoner experiments is ultimately a story about the choices that individuals and institutions make when confronted with opportunities to exercise power without accountability. It demonstrates that good intentions, patriotic motivations, and claims of necessity are insufficient protections against the abuse of power when those claims are not subject to independent verification and oversight. The forgotten secrets of America's treatment of Japanese prisoners remind us that the price of freedom is not just eternal vigilance against external enemies, but constant accountability for the actions of our own institutions. The secrets were kept not to protect national security, but to protect those who violated the principles they claimed to defend. Today, more than 75 years after the end of World War II, many of the documents that could provide complete answers to questions about the experimental program remain classified. The institutional mechanisms that enabled the cover-up continue to operate, and the legal frameworks that prevented accountability remain largely unchanged. Robert Morrison died knowing that the full truth about Operation Blackout would likely never be revealed. But he also believed that partial truth was better than complete silence, and that each revelation of official misconduct made future cover-ups more difficult to maintain. They can classify the documents, transfer the personnel, and claim national security," Morrison said during his final interview. "But they can't erase the human cost of what they did. The families who lost loved ones, the veterans who carried these secrets until they died, the prisoners who were tortured and murdered, their stories survive even when the official records are destroyed. And eventually those stories will be heard." The Japanese prisoners who disappeared into classified facilities during World War II were victims of systematic crimes that continue to influence American conduct today. Their stories, preserved through fragmentary evidence and survivor testimony, provide crucial insights into how democratic institutions can fail to protect basic human rights when secrecy enables abuse and classification prevents accountability. Understanding their experiences is not just a matter of historical interest, but a requirement for anyone who wants to understand how power operates in democratic societies and what protections are necessary to prevent systematic abuse by those who claim to act in the public interest. The secrets America tried to bury have been partially revealed, but much remains hidden. The institutional mechanisms that enabled systematic torture and its cover-up during World War II continue to operate today. The only protection against their abuse is public awareness, institutional accountability, and the willingness of citizens to demand truth even when it challenges comfortable narratives about their government's conduct. The Japanese prisoners whose stories have been told here represent thousands of victims whose experiences remain hidden by classification and official denial. Their legacy is not just the documentation of systematic abuse, but the demonstration that secrets kept to protect power eventually become weapons against the very principles that power claims to defend. The trail of evidence leads from Facility C7 to Abu Ghraib, from Dr. Kellerman's experimental protocols to CIA black sites, from the cover-up of Japanese prisoner experiments to contemporary assertions that torture doesn't happen or doesn't work. The institutional DNA of systematic abuse, once embedded in American security operations, has reproduced itself across decades and conflicts because the original crimes were never fully acknowledged or addressed. Robert Morrison's hidden cache of documents, discovered in that California renovation, contained one final piece of evidence that connects the historical crimes to contemporary reality. A memo dated November 12, 1945, from General MacArthur's intelligence chief to the Pentagon, outlined plans for preserving and expanding the experimental program into peacetime intelligence operations. The enhanced debriefing techniques developed during Pacific operations represent a significant advancement in intelligence capability, the memo stated. Recommend establishment of permanent research facility to continue development of these methods for use against Soviet prisoners and communist sympathizers. Dr. Kellerman's protocols should form the foundation for expanded psychological operations program. That recommendation was approved and implemented. The techniques tested on Japanese prisoners became the basis for programs that would span decades, from Korea to Vietnam to the War on Terror. Each new conflict brought the same patterns: systematic abuse disguised as intelligence operations, official denials when evidence surfaced, and classification used to prevent accountability. The institutional memory of how to torture prisoners and cover up evidence was passed down through training programs, operational manuals, and informal networks of personnel who moved between different agencies and assignments. What had been experimental during World War II became routine during the Cold War, and what had been hidden by classification during the Cold War became normalized during the War on Terror. Understanding this continuity is crucial for recognizing that contemporary cases of prisoner abuse are not aberrations or isolated incidents, but predictable outcomes of institutional cultures and operational procedures that were developed through systematic torture of Japanese prisoners during World War II. The techniques change, the justifications evolve, but the underlying patterns remain consistent because the institutional frameworks that enable systematic abuse have never been dismantled. The Japanese prisoners who were tortured and killed in facilities like C7 died not just as casualties of war, but as victims of systematic crimes that established precedents for decades of additional victims. Their suffering contributed directly to the development of techniques that would be used to torture American soldiers captured in Korea and Vietnam, foreign prisoners held in CIA facilities around the world, and detainees held at Guantanamo Bay and other contemporary facilities. Dr. Patricia Williams, the military nurse who assisted with experimental procedures at Facility C7, offered her own reflection on this legacy during her final interview before her death in 2007. "We told ourselves we were serving our country, that what we were doing would save American lives and end the war faster. But what we really did was create a system for turning human beings into laboratory animals, and we taught that system to a generation of military and intelligence personnel who would use it against new victims for decades to come." Williams spent the last years of her life advocating for acknowledgement of the experimental program and support for its victims. She testified before congressional committees, provided depositions for legal proceedings, and spoke at educational conferences about the institutional factors that had enabled her participation in systematic torture. "The most important lesson," Williams emphasized, "is that ordinary people become capable of extraordinary evil when they accept official justifications without demanding independent verification. We were told that classified operations required different moral standards, that national security justified extreme measures, and that questioning orders would compromise operational effectiveness. We believed these claims because we wanted to believe them, because the alternative was admitting that we were participating in crimes against humanity." Williams' testimony provides crucial insight into how institutional cultures normalize systematic abuse and prevent individual resistance. The personnel who participated in the experimental program were not sociopaths or sadists, but ordinary military and medical professionals who gradually adapted to increasingly extreme requirements as part of their normal duties. This normalization process is visible in the documented escalation of experimental procedures over time. Early protocols involved relatively standard interrogation techniques enhanced with drugs and sleep deprivation. Later protocols included surgical procedures, psychological conditioning, and eventually systematic torture designed not to extract information but to test the limits of human psychological and physical endurance. The escalation occurred because each step was presented as a logical extension of previously accepted practices, and because classification prevented personnel from understanding the full scope of what they were participating in. Individual guards and medical personnel saw only their specific roles, not the comprehensive program of systematic torture and human experimentation. This compartmentalization was a deliberate feature of the program design, intended to prevent individual resistance and maintain operational security. By limiting each person's knowledge to their specific assignment, officials could ensure participation without full comprehension of the overall program's criminal nature. The same compartmentalization strategies have been used in subsequent torture programs to prevent individual resistance and maintain plausible deniability for senior officials. Personnel are told that their specific actions serve legitimate intelligence purposes, while the systematic nature of the abuse is hidden through classification and operational compartmentalization. Breaking these patterns requires not just individual moral courage, but institutional changes that make it impossible to hide systematic abuse through classification and compartmentalization. This means developing oversight mechanisms that can penetrate operational security, legal frameworks that protect whistleblowers who expose systematic abuse, and cultural changes that prioritize accountability over institutional loyalty. The Japanese prisoner experimental program demonstrates that good intentions, professional competence, and patriotic motivation are insufficient protections against systematic abuse when institutions are designed to prevent oversight and accountability. The personnel who participated in torture and human experimentation were not monsters, but ordinary people who accepted institutional justifications for extraordinary crimes. Their experiences provide crucial lessons for recognizing and resisting similar justifications in contemporary contexts. When officials claim that extreme measures are necessary for national security, when they assert that classified operations require different moral standards, when they argue that questioning methods will compromise effectiveness, these are the same arguments used to justify systematic torture and human experimentation during World War II. The legacy of the Japanese prisoner experiments is not just historical knowledge, but practical understanding of how democratic institutions can be perverted to enable systematic abuse when citizens accept official claims without demanding transparency and accountability. The techniques developed through torture of Japanese prisoners continue to influence contemporary operations because the institutional mechanisms that enabled the original crimes have never been adequately reformed. Robert Morrison, the archivist who discovered the first evidence of Operation Blackout, understood that revealing fragments of truth was not sufficient to prevent repetition of systematic abuse. Full accountability required not just acknowledgement of historical crimes, but institutional reforms that would make similar cover-ups impossible in the future. Every document they classify, every witness they silence, every investigation they block makes it easier for them to do it again, Morrison observed during his final interview. The only way to prevent future atrocities is to ensure that past atrocities cannot be hidden. Secrecy is the enabler of systematic abuse, and transparency is the only protection against its repetition. Morrison's insight remains relevant today as classification systems continue to hide evidence of systematic abuse, and official denials continue to contradict documented evidence of torture and human rights violations. The institutional mechanisms that enabled the cover-up of Japanese prisoner experiments operate in contemporary contexts to prevent accountability for similar crimes. The choice facing American society is whether to continue accepting official justifications for secrecy and extreme measures, or to demand the transparency and accountability necessary to prevent systematic abuse. The Japanese prisoners who were tortured and killed in classified facilities during World War II cannot be brought back to life, but their stories can serve as warnings about the consequences of accepting power without accountability. Their legacy demands that we refuse to accept comfortable lies about American conduct, that we challenge official denials with documented evidence, and that we insist on institutional reforms that make systematic abuse impossible to hide and impossible to justify. The secrets America tried to bury have been partially revealed, but the institutional mechanisms that created those secrets remain largely intact. The Japanese prisoners whose suffering contributed to decades of systematic torture by American forces deserve better than historical footnotes and classified files. They deserve acknowledgement, accountability, and institutional changes that ensure their experiences serve as lessons rather than precedents for future atrocities. The forgotten secrets of Operation Blackout remind us that the price of liberty is not just vigilance against external enemies, but eternal accountability for the actions of our own institutions. The prisoners who disappeared into classified facilities, the veterans who carried unbearable secrets until their deaths, and the families who searched for truth they would never find, their stories continue to demand answers that classification and official denial cannot silence forever. In the end, the most powerful weapon against systematic abuse is not classification or compartmentalization, but the human capacity to remember suffering, to demand truth, and to refuse comfortable lies about power exercised without constraint. The Japanese prisoners who were tortured in America's name during World War II left behind more than fragmentary records and survivor testimony. They left behind the moral imperative to ensure that such crimes cannot be repeated under any justification, in any conflict, by any government that claims to act in defense of human freedom and dignity.